Hi friends, it's Melissa Mortensen from Polka Dot Chair, and I am excited to start sewing today in our Bluegrass Sampler Quilt-along. Today we are going to be talking about the foundation paper pieced portions, say that 5 times fast, of the barn and fence quilt blocks. I'm going to be doing most of the filming over at my sewing table, which is over here. I've got a camera on my sewing machine. I've got a camera on my cutting mat. That way we can get really good detailed up-close videos for you so you can see what I'm doing and as I'm doing it. I'll also share all my tips with you. If you're new here, there is still time to join the quilt-along. You can stop by my blog, polka-dot-chair.com, fill out the form. We'll send you this little planner that has the schedule for the quilt-along with the blocks and information about the pattern. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to start working with these house and barn blocks, talking about how to foundation paper piece that isosceles triangle there at the top of that. If you have questions as you're watching the video, be sure to leave them in the comments. I'll be checking in several times a day to see how you guys are doing. I'm also considering resurrecting my Facebook group so that you guys can share your blocks as we sew. I'm working on that right now, and I'll hopefully have more details to share with you at the next video. All right, we're ready to sew. I'm going to switch around my camera setup and move over to my sewing machine and start sewing these blocks along with you. If you haven't already, take a moment and read through the sewing pattern. There are a few important tips and reminders at the beginning under this before you begin. You want to make sure that you kind of take an inventory, what's in the pattern. You can see how the pattern is written and how the illustrations are done. One thing to note with this pattern is that the cutting directions are listed per block because there are so many small pieces in this quilt. I was just concerned that if I had you cut all the pieces out at the same time, you just get all your pieces mixed up. So they are listed per block. And then I have, because you'll notice it'll say fabric S, fabric R, I have for you included a color sheet that's got your key. You might want to keep this close by as you're sewing so you can't remember if it says piece D and E, then you know you're dealing with these 2 pieces of fabric if you're sewing from the kit. I mentioned before, if you're not sewing from my fabric or from a kit, then you can take the actual fabrics you're sewing from and pin them or staple them onto this sheet to keep track of for yourself as well. I've also included layout diagrams and another full color photo of the quilt in addition to the one on the front. And then in the back we've got your foundation paper piecing patterns, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Before we get started, I wanted to point out a correction, 2 corrections to the pattern. I'll put this on the website as well. But on page, let me get a pencil. So on page 8, right here under step 3 chimney section, it has you sew these pieces together, and it states that this piece here is 2 by 2.5 when it actually should be 2 by 3.5. The pattern has you cut the correct size. I'm going to make sure I've got all my pages straight. Where's page 7? Yeah, so the pattern has you cut the correct size piece of fabric, but this just should be 3.5 instead of 2.5. So you do have two. This is like quite the tongue twister. You do have 2 by 3.5 inch pieces of fabric A cut already. It's just this one should be 3.5, not 2.5. The second mistake is under house block number 2. Luckily, it is a mistake that your piece needs to be smaller, not larger. So if you've already cut it out, you can just trim it. Instead of the fabric K being 3.5 by 5, fabric K should be 3.5 by 4.5, and that comes into play here on page 10 with this assembly right here. You can see I've scratched a little because I was just double checking my math one more time before I told you, because I didn't want to tell you the wrong thing. So fabric K, which is the door, should be 3.5 by 4.5 instead of 3.5 by 5, which allows the 2 fabric cue pieces on each side of it to nest nicely in there. This will be updated in the pattern update section on the website, which you can find the URL for it right here. It says visit polkadotchair.com/pattern updates to check for corrections or updates. If we find any more corrections as we go, I'll be sure to update them there. I do send all of my patterns out to editors twice. These are just things that I didn't catch and they didn't catch. It's just, so I'm very sorry about that, but we do try really hard to make sure we get accurate patterns out to you, but that's why we have this pattern updates website as a way to communicate with you if there's something that we missed. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about foundation paper piecing. And I know some of you, this is brand new. Some of you, you've done this before. If you have foundation paper piece before, my technique might be a little different than what you're used to, or it may be the same as what you're used to, but I will walk you through the steps. So there are only a few foundation paper pieced sections on this pattern. One of them is in this triangle of the roof for the house blocks. Let me make sure I'm telling you which correct block that is, because they all have names. So that is house block number 2 is this one. So this has a foundation paper piece portion. This block, this is a test block that I made before I wrote the pattern. This piece of the roof is also foundation paper piece. This is the test block I did before. It was foundation paper piece. You can see nothing lined up. They were half rectangles, and the math on it was getting kind of crazy, so I decided it would just be simpler to foundation paper piece. So it's just, you're dealing with this section here and this section here. This is not foundation paper piece, but I included it because we're working on the barn blocks this week, barn and house blocks. And then the fence sections of the quilt can be foundation paper pieced or traditionally pieced. I highly recommend trying foundation paper piecing them because when you're dealing with long strips of fabric, it's just so easy to distort your fabric, and you get you'll get a fence that's not really a fence post, won't be square. It'll be kind of wonky. Your seams won't be straight. So if you are able to try it, I definitely recommend trying foundation paper piecing. I am going to start with the foundation paper piecing portion. I don't know how many times I'm going to say that today before I get messed up, of house block number 2. If I can see. So I'm going to look through all of my inserts for the pattern, and I am just using the paper that came with the pattern. I did not copy it onto foundation paper piecing paper. You can do that. I have done it before. I really do I like to use newsprint, but if that is something you just want to use what we have, then it does not matter. All right. Put this aside just so I don't have so many papers. I'm going to start with number 2 just because I think it's a little simpler, and we'll just start with the simplest one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've got my pieces cut out. In the pattern, it notes where you should cut. It tells you to cut out fabric for it. A lot of times with foundation paper piecing, there are not cutting directions because you cut the fabric as you go. But I wanted to give you guys a jumping off point, so I did include some directions for that. So what I'm going to do is very carefully cut these, making sure not to cut any of the actual pattern. Just to trim it down, get some of this extra fabric off. Or not fabric, paper. I'm already all tongue-twisted, tongue-tied. All right, so we've got house block number 2 here. So you'll see that you've got section A, 1, 2, 3. So that tells you the order that you need to work in while you're working on the pattern. If you come back to the pattern, it will show you, okay, if you come back to the pattern, it shows you which fabric goes where. So here, section, so if you want to just note, so we've got section A1 is fabric U, section A2 is fabric S, and section A3 is fabric A. So just do that really quick to transpose. The reason that it doesn't have it listed on the foundation paper piecing piece is because if you are sewing this later in a couple years from now where this fabric's no longer available and you're doing something completely different, it just gives you the option to be able to customize it and not be confused there. All right, so I've got that. So I know, just because I cut it out already, these are the fabric pieces that I need for this section. I think I might have cut that. This looks the wrong size. I may have cut it the wrong size. We'll find out. All right, I mentioned I thought I had cut a piece of fabric the wrong size, and I did. I had cut the gingham the wrong size, so I've recut it. It's the correct size on the pattern, which is 4.5 by 6.5. I cut it at 5.5, so my mistake. When you foundation paper piece, you can see I realized my mistake because I was sewing, because I've got a little bit torn off there. When you foundation paper piece, a couple things to keep in mind. You're always going to have the paper side up when you sew, and you always want to have the wrong side of the paper and the wrong side of the fabric facing. This piece of fabric is the same size as my piece here with the seam allowance included. So what I like to do is use a light box. If you don't have a light box, you can use a window. You can also use a clear baking sheet and the flashlight on your phone if you don't have access to that either. I'm going to need a couple of pins here. And what I'm doing is I'm lining it up so that I can see that this piece of fabric is going to cover my piece all the way up to the seam allowance. And I'll just put a couple pins in to keep the fabric from moving as we get started. All right, then I can move my light box away. Now, I do this with all my foundation paper piecing portions, is I come in and I like to fold back on the seam lines I'm gonna sew, just so I can see how things are gonna lay, like so. All right. Now, if you are new, if you have done foundation paper piecing before, this next step may seem different, or maybe this is the way you do it too. But what I like to do, so I'm going to work between A1 and A2, and then I'll go to 3. So you go 1, 2, 3. I realize that on this particular piece you're working you're working clockwise, which may seem different if you're right-handed. So make sure you go from A1 to A2. I used a piece of cardboard to fold back on the seam line, and then I used my add-a-quarter ruler to trim this piece of fabric. And what that does is that's my seam line, and that is my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, when I've got this piece upside down, I know where my fabric is, and I know where it needs to go because I've got this seam. Now I'll take this piece of fabric, which is, as noted on the pattern, fabric S, and just place it right there so that the seams are lined up with the fabric right sides facing, and then very carefully turn it right side up. And then I'm going to go to my sewing machine and sew on this seam. On my sewing machine, I have set my stitch length down to 1.5, which will help me tear the paper out afterwards. On this piece, you're going to start sewing in the seam allowance at the bottom corner, but stop when you get to the top, which will make sense in a minute. We're just going to sew that. And then stop sewing right at that top point. Now that that is sewn, you're going to use an iron. If you can set this up somewhere that you're not standing up to use your iron every time you have to do this, you'll be a lot happier with this technique, trust me. If you have to keep standing up every time you have to press, then it might not be your favorite thing. All right, so I've got piece S sewn, and I don't need to trim the seam allowance on that one. Now, since this one's a triangle, I'm actually going to do the same thing again and push this back, use my add-a-quarter ruler, trim this off, and then take the second piece of fabric, which is fabric A, and place it on top of there and take it to my machine and sew. that is sewn, and I press it. And I have removed the pins. Now what we need to do is, just using a standard quilt ruler, we need to trim this piece on the outside line. Make sure you're not trimming it on that inside line, because that's your seam line, not your seam allowance. And hopefully we'll end up with a piece the same size. Sometimes I don't put the fabric in exact the right place and I have to do it again. All right, there we go. It looks good. Now we're ready to move on to constructing the rest of the portions of this house block. What you'll want to do when you're ready to start, so here on the pattern under house block 2, foundation paper piece this top sections of the roof and then create the quarter square triangles. Now the quarter square triangles of this block we're going to cover next week if you've not made a quarter square triangle. And then you're able to assemble the rest of your block. So before you're able to assemble the rest of your block, you just need to remove the paper, and that is why you've got that seam cut, or not the seam, your stitch length small, because then it just makes it really easy just to tear this out. And you've got a perfectly pieced roof section. All right, so that is the first section of the roof portion of house block number 2. There's a second foundation paper piece section. Let me get out the finished block to show you. This piece here is also foundation paper piece, but it's even easier because there's only one seam. So you're just going to sew right on that line and cut it out along the rectangle. So we'll put this aside. Now you also are going to, so the reason there's 2 of these, one is A and one is C, is because the 2 house blocks in the quilt are mirror images of each other, which means the white fabric on the roof is on the left on this one and on the right on this one. And instead of putting that in the pattern, it just was easier to call these C and then use the fabric noted in the pattern to piece C, so you don't have to worry about keeping track of your rights and lefts. Now that the house block 2 one is finished, let's do one more. Let's do house block number 1, just to give you another, just kind of walk you through the process again. Once more, I like to trim the extra paper off. It's easier to see. So this piece A1 again is the same size, the same width as your finished piece. So we're going to want to make sure when we place this on here that we get this in the right spot. You can also cut your piece bigger than noted on the pattern. I was just trying to get, so you guys could, I don't like a lot of waste, which is one thing you do kind of get a lot with foundation paper piecing, so I was trying to be conservative with that. With longer pieces like this, I definitely want to put in 2 pins to keep that in place, like so. All right, I'm going to do the same thing again, starting with between A1 and A2. And one more thing I need to make sure I do, which I haven't done yet, on the pattern here. So section A1 is fabric R, section A2 is fabric A, section A3 is fabric N, and section A4 is fabric A, which I checked beforehand, that's why. But just as a reminder, write that down before you get sewing, just so you don't get mixed up. All right, so now take one of our fabric A rectangles and place it along the seam and take it to my machine and sew. You'll notice this piece has you sew into the seam allowance on both ends of the line. All right, so that is sewn, and we have the roof line of house block number 1 completed. Tear that off, complete the block, the rest of the block as shown in the pattern. Last thing I want to briefly touch on is the fence portions of the blocks, which are even easier because they are all straight lines. There are 2 fence blocks in the quilt. It's easier to show you on the illustration than it is on the quilt because the quilt is so big. Fence block number 2 is smaller and shorter. Fence block number 1 is longer and sewn from a different fabric. We are going to work, so we've got fence block number 2, we're gonna work on fence block number 1, just one portion of it. Fence block number 1, you'll notice there is section A, section B, and section C. So you'll foundation paper piece all of A, all of B, all of C, and then you sew the 3 pieces to each other. So we'll just start with A. As I said before, you can traditionally piece this if you want. The instructions are included in the pattern. It does tell you in the pattern, so it does note in the pattern. So for fence block number 2, if you're going to foundation paper piece this, you need to cut your pieces bigger because you need to include your seam allowance. So if you're foundation paper piecing it, you need to cut your pieces an inch bigger than noted where there's an asterisk. So instead of cutting my pieces 1 by 6.5, I've cut them 2 by 7.5. And what I like to do, so we've got fabric A, fabric S, fabric A, fabric S, is I just kind of, because I know S is the print fabric, I just come in and like scribble so that as I get going, I can keep track of it. So for the first piece on this one, we're starting with fabric A. Make sure fabric A covers that outside seam allowance. Now this one I am not going to trim first because I can kind of see a little better. It's all straight lines and my pieces are nice and large, so I'll show you a little different method for this one. So I'll just take these 2 pieces of fabric, right size facing, fabric is plenty big, like so, and I'm going to come in and sew on the line between A1 and A2. Now what I want to do is take this, pull this up, trim my seam allowance, and then over to my iron and press this down. All right, now we are ready. If you're worried about covering that seam line, you can use your light box, but again, these pieces are 2 inches, fabric is cut different. All right, so we're just gonna take, now we'll take the white. That's a better cut than the other one. I don't know why the other one did not trim perfectly. All right, take the other piece. And you don't want to go all the way down here. You want to put it up here. If you're more comfortable with it, let's just go ahead and trim this seam so you know where to put that next piece of fabric. See, I tried to do it the other way, and I always come back to this method where I cut the seam allowance first so I can see what I'm doing. I also think if you trim the seam allowance first, you don't need to use a light box as much because you can see where your seam is. So I won't do this whole thing, but you can see this is so simple. You do all of your straight lines. alternating the white and the print fabrics, and then you'll come in after those are all sewn, trim here, and do your fabric S's for the fence posts on the side, and then cut it out the same way you did cut out around the seam allowance the same way you did for the house rooftops. So that is everything for today. I mentioned before, next week we are going to cover, I believe it's the flag blocks and the stars. And since we're talking about Ohio stars and quarter square triangles next week, at that point I'll talk to you about creating the smaller Ohio star blocks included in these house blocks. If you want to wait to assemble those until next week, if you want to see how I make those Ohio star blocks, you're welcome to do that. Also cover a half square triangle, which is what we are going to use for the middle of this barn block, and these flag blocks, which have flying geese. They're very simple to sew, kind of fun little blocks to sew there. So hopefully this helped you understand foundation paper piecing. I always joke it's hard to walk and talk at the same time. Sometimes it's hard to talk and quilt at the same time. So hopefully I explained myself well. If I didn't, please just leave me a comment in the comment section and I will address it in our next week's video. If there's something that was really confusing to you, let me know. Hopefully I can make it just as clear as possible, and have fun sewing. So the goal this week is to get all the foundation paper piece portions of this quilt sewn, including all of the fence blocks.